Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. Today, we're going to kind of round out the industrial age with a quick discussion on the workers. So, we've highlighted these titans of industry, these robber barons, however you want to refer to them, like Rockefeller and Carnegie. But we do need to highlight what working conditions were like. And this is going to lead to some changes in how workers try to work together through trade unions in order to gain some of these rights back. And so it was certainly with these poorer living conditions and more dangerous work conditions, you are going to see workers try to band together to improve these. So we're going to start with working conditions, and we're going to be able to identify how factory workers toiled under these terrible conditions. And so I want you, for my students, to kind of be able to identify what some of these issues are, and then we're going to talk about how workers try to fix them. So let's start with just the fact that industrial growth was creating many new jobs, particularly in our cities. And one of the things that happens as that growth occurs is that working conditions continue to worsen. They deteriorate. Problems ranged from long hours. We don't have the 8-hour workday yet instilled. There's also low pay, unsafe working conditions in factories and mines. And also you see the presence of sweatshops, which are particularly for garments or for the textile industry. But this is a shop or a factory where workers would work these long hours at low wages under these unhealthy conditions. Women and children in particular, especially as they worked in factories, they were not compensated equally to men. And in many cases, they received half of what a man might receive in the same job. And so what you're going to see with these conditions is a need to re-examine them and a way for workers to kind of work together as one in order to make change. So discussion question, checking question here. Sweatshops were dangerous urban factories manufacturing particularly what product? Was it automobile parts, garments, food products, or electrical supplies? Pause the video here if you need to think about it. But the best answer here is our garments, mostly textiles, and in particular clothing. So how are workers going to combat these conditions? And that's where we're going to see workers begin to organize into labor unions in order to address the wages, to try to get better wages, benefits, which would be today, if you think about a job that has benefits, might have insurance. It might have a retirement plan or 401k or other perks that, aside from your wage, come with your position. And then, of course, better working conditions. And so we're going to talk about how they try to come together to do that. Well, it just starts with not being satisfied. And workers would come together, talk about these conditions, and then they decide to organize. And they're going to organize into unions, or what we call labor unions. And collectively, they're going to work together. And that's a really important word, is collective, coming together to work on these things. They're going to demand better pay and better working conditions. And this is something that, again, also you see a growing divide between the rich and the poor. People see that and they want to have more. They want to have more of that profit that's, booming during this time period. And they also want to be safe while they work. So trade unions often represented only one trade. And because they limited themselves so much, they in many ways weren't very effective. And so what you're going to see is you're going to see these larger labor unions, which are going to encapsulate or have many different trades underneath one banner in order to have more power. And so one of the early examples of this is a group that's led by Terence V. Powderly, by the name of the Knights of Labor. They're going to meet secretly at first, and then later on become a lot more of a public player. And they had special ways of identifying each other so that companies wouldn't try to, infiltrate their ranks. And so they're going to try to work together in order to make, these things happen. But we're going to see a lot of change is with another group called the American Federation of Labor, or sometimes just referred to as the AFL. And this is actually still in existence today. And it's led by a man by the name of Samuel Gompers. They're going to represent skilled workers in a variety of different crafts, in a variety of different skill sets and trades. And they're going to push for better wages, better working conditions. But they're also going to push for something called collective bargaining. And this is kind of where an employer will sit down with union representatives to represent the workers, typically voted on by the workers, to discuss things like wages and hours and working conditions and trying to find common ground. This is still a tactic that's used between unions and employers today in a variety of different settings. And certainly there are particular events that highlight some of these dangerous working conditions. Probably one of our best examples is in the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. Is a company that makes clothing, and there's a fire at one of their sweatshops. And that action, and that lack of action from the employer, led to the International Ladies Garment Workers Union to start pushing for safer working conditions. You're also going to see later on, when we get into the progressive era, that these working conditions are going to be highlighted in famous works like, say, The Jungle, which are going to lead to more government agency, like the FDA, for example, in monitoring things like meatpacking plants. But we're not quite there yet. Now, companies, of course, didn't like this because they like having their power and they wanted to help ensure some control over their employees. And so companies often hired what we call strikebreakers to replace striking workers. And the whole goal basically was a strikebreaker is a person who was hired to replace a worker that was striking in order to try to break up the strike, to not stop production, and just to show workers that, hey, if you want to hold out, we'll replace you with somebody else, because there were many people who wanted jobs. And another tactic that was sometimes used was something called an injunction, in which a court order was used to stop unions from striking. And it could have been for a variety of different reasons, including like, lack of sales, or, if they provided a certain service that they could say, for the benefit of this community, we're not going to allow you to continue to strike. And Eugene V. Debs is a great example of this, sent to jail after the Pullman strike, because it obstructed the railroads and the mail, which was, again, seen as a service that was provided to the public, and the union was denying this to people. And so it wasn't uncommon for the courts to get involved in trying to break up those strikes as well. So that fire that we mentioned with the Triangular Shirtwaist Company factory brought attention to what? The unsafe working conditions, low wages, child labor, or lunch and bathroom breaks. Pause if you need to. But with the fire, that's the unsafe working conditions. Absolutely. And so with these conditions being highlighted, you are going to see groups like the AFL continue to grow, especially as we head into the 20th century. And then you're going to also, again, start to see legislation being implemented towards the beginning of the 20th century, so the beginning of the 1900s, in order to combat these conditions as well. But that's where we're going to wrap up this section on the industrial age. Certainly could go into a little bit more detail here, but for my students, make sure you've been following along with the guided notes. For those of you who are just listening, I hope that we kind of helped you understand, some of the beginnings of unions and these working conditions. And I hope that we've also maybe just helped you gain some understanding of the history of our country. So thank you so much for listening, and have a wonderful day.